Amazing. Yeah. So yeah, good morning, good evening. It's great to see everyone here tonight. Well, this morning. And yeah, so my name's Nufpree. I'm with Code Pink. I'm the coordinator of the campaign, The Basis of Cyprus, and I do some social media as well for Code Pink's National. And I'm so excited for today for us to have a conversation about what we're calling like the supply chain of death. And I think with the three speakers we have here, we'll kind of understand what constitutes this supply chain and then, take some time to think about what we can all do in our various locations across the world to expose it and challenge it and work to dismantle it. For just, our context now, we're obviously in this, supposed ceasefire moment, of course, which Israel violates, multiple times every day. It's a ceasefire where they can basically determine the terms, of course, with the complete and total protection of the United States. But this gives us some time to, kind of deepen some of our work that our movements have been doing. And I think a big part of this is about the surveillance flights that Britain and the US and Israel obviously have been taking over Gaza, which have been the primary way that Israel has been able to target attacks. And that's a really substantial part of what we want to talk about tonight, but also the kind of colonial relations that have facilitated bombing Yemen, Iran, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, many other places across West Asia, North Africa, and really, facilitated a lot of the violence of the US empire, of course, which Britain plays a substantial role in. So that is my bit of context. Today we'll have three speakers speak about kind of a bit of history and context in the US, Britain, and Cyprus, which are the three places that make up the campaign basis of Cyprus. Part of what I'll be talking about is also part of a joint letter that we published a few weeks ago. And this joint letter is another way for us to kind of come together internationally to highlight the solidarity and unity we have across these three countries and showing that we collectively oppose the use of bases, land, public money to facilitate US imperialism. I'm sharing the letter in the chat if you haven't yet. After this, you can read a bit more if you want a bit more context in some of the things people bring up, and also sign and share. It's a way that we're trying to build up the campaign and the movement. So before I go in to introduce the speakers we have, if you have any questions or ideas or suggestions at any point, please put them in the chat, and we'll have some time for Q&A. To go through the order of this webinar, we're going to start with Jaylan, who is going to talk to us a bit about the context in Cyprus and a bit in Britain, I feel, and maybe touch on parts of the Cypriot diaspora. Then we'll have Alfie, who will talk about the context in Britain, particularly in London, and the role that Britain's been playing. And finally, Brian, who will talk about Reno, Sierra Nevada, and some of the work in the US that's being done. After that, we'll have a kind of discussion between the speakers, to kind of get into a few more of the points that we're talking about and how we can all use this information to engage. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So have your questions ready, and if you put them in the chat, we can go through them. So yeah, will start with Jaylan, just a very brief introduction. I'm sure you can introduce yourself with far greater way, but Jaylan is a researcher who is developing non-extractive methodologies and advocating for the decolonization of Cyprus, which you all support. She organizes safer spaces for conflict transformation and disseminating anti-colonial education. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'm really excited to get into some of the things we talk about a bit further.
Thanks, Nufri. It's really nice to be here. And I've actually been really wanting to kind of disseminate this kind of presentation to a further audience. So this is a really good opportunity for that. I'm basically representing Rizzo Collective, and we're an educational internationalist organization, and our aim is to connect the dots between local struggles, and we do it from a perspective of understanding that change doesn't happen when it's limited to political discourse, but when communities have what they need to be autonomous. So that's kind of the lens that we also look at this issue through. So I'm just going to share some slides and hopefully, is that all good for everyone?
Yeah, looks great.
Cool. Just, all right, nice. Cool. So it's probably worth starting with like just a quick baseline. The SVAs in Cyprus consist of Akotili and Dikelia. They've been retained by the UK in the 1960 treaty, which is supposedly for independence. I say that with strong rabbit ears. Um, but they are military bases with civilian administration under the UK Ministry of Defence. They were retained originally for the UK's Cold War interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. And just to give like strong like how close this is like geopolitically as well to Gaza. Cyprus is only 250 miles from Gaza, which is essentially the length of the island. And 350 miles from the Suez Canal, which is the original intention of the British retaining their control over the island. Um, and Akrotiri and Dikele operate under a military dictatorship, which actually contains citizens of Cyprus within it, which don't have access to actual Cypriot governance. They are limited to SBA governance. So that's why I refer to them as colonies, because that's what they are. And Dikelia, its main role, it provides logistical and operational infrastructure for approximately 4,000 UK military and civilian personnel. And Akrotiri supports UK and allied military activities, including arms shipments, intelligence sharing for operations such as Israel's Gaza offensive. And the base has been described as a staging post. Well, the whole island has been described as a staging post for regional missions because it enhances NATO's operational reach in the Eastern Mediterranean. Trodos as well, the big ball, that big ugly ball right there, that's one of the retained sites which remain under legal jurisdiction of the Republic of Cyprus with specific rights and immunities granted to UK personnel, such as the freedom of transit, which is the right to move personnel, vehicles, aircraft, and military goods freely between the SBAs, which include Cypriot land. And these retained sites can also utilize the ports and the airports of the Republic of Cyprus. So this is where that line between what is the SBA's responsibility and Republic of Cyprus is actually incredibly blurred. And this includes the right to construct or use necessary lines of communication. So that's roads, wires, pipes. And the crimes of the personnel are exclusively judged by the UK courts unless it was a crime committed by a Cypriot citizen on their property. Sorry, against the Cypriot citizen or their property. And yeah, the conditions to facilitate this. So this is a postcard from the SBAs that some British postcard enthusiasts posted on a forum in 2021. So you can see the various conditions of the treaty, but also that Cypriot residents are subject to SBA law. And while other British overseas territories also experienced this same cultural annihilation, like the pubs and the British road names, only Cypriots were not automatically granted the right to register as full British citizens, which most other British overseas territory citizens were granted in 2002. So, and even when you do get that status, it doesn't automatically confer, it doesn't automatically mean the right to abode in the UK, which again, unlike most other British overseas territories, was the case post 2002 legislation. So our island seems to be the only one to occupy land that designates the local population as second-class residents and leaving refugees that arrive on those shores stateless. There have been like land disputes without access to legal recourse, and that's why these bases fit the bill for a neo-colony. And making sure that this is clear is not even to draw attention to the lack of agency or the stripping of agency from Cypriots, but is to understand how illegal these bases are and the fact that they are there to facilitate genocide is illegal in many, many ways, like not even just by international law, but by their own treaty. So speaking on terms that the colonizers understand, they don't pay the Republic of Cyprus for this land. They agreed to an annual settlement, which they did not pay either. The treaty has never been respected. It's supposed to coordinate with the Republic of Cyprus for military operations that could impact Cyprus, which has rarely happened. The Republic of Cyprus claims to have never received such updates regarding Palestine, Yemen, etc. And at the same time, the Republic of Cyprus asserts not to have requested to be informed on these matters. And typically, the Cypriot government just states it's not in a position to comment on the operations of third countries. But that's just the current violations. Like historically, it's consistent. So in the context of Iraq and Afghanistan, many scholars have revealed the ways that the SBAs were supporting broader missions encompassing counterterrorism and intelligence coordination and nation building efforts, which far surpass the military scope. So kind of just to summarize like everything that the SBA has done against Palestine. Um, Countless fights between Al-Qudsi and Israel without informing Cypriot officials, US Air Force refueling tankers that enable Israeli fighter jets to conduct airstrikes in Gaza, arms transfers to Israel, including components for F-35 jets, intelligence and surveillance. Ios Nikolaos, which is next to Dikelia, is accused of intercepting communications used to coordinate counterattacks. Yeah, the RAF Typhoon to bomb Yemen, all of the planes. Um, and on just to like represent how much power the British Army has just from having that position. On March 31st of this year alone, the UK deployed RAF aircrafts to the Red Sea, the Black Sea, Gaza, and Syria all on the same day. So this is going to be discussed a lot in this webinar, but Britain and the US created an air bridge made up of the bases in Britain, Greece, Cyprus, Italy, and Germany. Over 6,000 military flights have flown to occupied Palestine for surveillance, refueling operations, and the supplies of weapons. So again, don't want the SBAs to obscure the responsibility that lies with the Republic of Cyprus, because these bases are an integral part of Cyprus's strategic positioning as a frontline state for the West. The Republic of Cyprus officially shifted to Western-aligned foreign policies in 2012 and is currently an active participant and beneficiary in the genocide. They've deepened bilateral ties with Israel through defense agreements, which activists argue normalizes Israel's actions. They host joint military exercises with Israel to, in what's most relevant today, because we have a similar terrain to Lebanon, they've been able to practice for maximum efficiency when they destroy Lebanon as well. They don't challenge the operations despite their role in regional conflicts and our vulnerability to collateral damage. Our airports have been taken over by Israeli security multiple times, while US military aircrafts land and depart. There's been the HC Opal, which transported military supplies to Israel, arriving in Larnaca port, and so on and so on. This is endless how many events there's been that really just clearly display that Cyprus is an unsinkable aircraft, and there's nothing legal about it, but there's also no pushback. The government has been criticized for restricting pro-Palestine protests near the bases, and they have been getting increasingly violent and using police force. It's suspected that many of the police force in one of the biggest repressions that have happened so far at a protest in Nicosia, there were people that weren't speaking Greek, and there's a strong suspicion that some of that police force was actually Israeli. So the Zionist influence is really entrenching itself in Cypriot institutions, on top of benefiting from offshore gas projects. So the UK will paint this as regional stability, right? Like their presence is there to keep the region stable. So while this infrastructure, while the infrastructure investments are quantifiable, the UK government has not provided full transparency on annual operational costs. Matt Kennard's reporting emphasizes the taxpayer burdens are likely underestimated due to secrecy around military expenditures, but this is what we do know and can kind of assume costs around it. As you can see, Cyprus is the most expensive. So in terms of why they even still exist, it's complicated, but also not complicated. They've been written into the constitution of a neo-colony with three guarantors, which means a lot of negotiation, and at the end of it, Cypriot agency is non-existent. And according to the UN Charter, principles of self-determination override colonial era agreements, which weren't even agreements in the first place, but are coerced consent. And this is where we really want to kind of address or ride the momentum of Chagos liberating itself, because the mechanisms of negotiation were local demonstrations of popular consent, bilateral negotiation, and international legal pressure. And this is why it's important to talk about the bases as what they are. They're colonies of a foreign occupation, which are not compliant with post-colonial laws. And the UN itself, again, also considers all overseas territories as colonies. They formally list 17 territories as non-self-governing territories, but the UK does not report on the SPAs as if that's what they are. So again, with the hard work of the Chagossians, which have not achieved any justice because it's just been sold to another island, it's not actually Diego Garcia is still there, and it's still not Chagossians that have autonomy over the place that they live in. But they have brought the nature of British overseas territories to light, and we want all these neo-colonial infrastructures to be dismantled together. Historically, this is probably the only example we have, unfortunately, of a political figure actually bringing the bases into question. But there has been a lot of academic writings, and there was even a British judge in a case where refugees had landed in Akrotiri and no one was taking responsibility for their human rights. And it kind of exposed the SVAs for what they were as a colony. And a judge even referred to it as this in a UK court. So why it's important to discuss this in the context of Palestine as well is because the Cypriot cause is beyond the Cyprus problem. Um, the British government themselves state that popular consent can have the status of the overseas territories discussed. Not that this has been successful in many cases, but in Bermuda's referendum, over 60% of Bermuda's population is of African descent, but the economic elite, which is primarily white European, are historically opposed independence over fear of losing privileges, which is a context that Cyprus does not have. And we are the only British overseas territory that is currently implicated in genocide. Um, and Cyprus has never had its opportunity to actually express its consent to remain a British colony. So at the moment, what Cypriots on the ground are doing are trying to mobilize to demilitarize, which is very hopeful, but for the bare minimum to just return sovereignty from the bases. And that is because the bases are facilitating genocide. It's not for any kind of unification of the island, which is obviously a lovely symptom of it. But the focus is that this this dispute, this conflict is permitting this to carry on and it needs to be solved. And yeah, so this is kind of what we feel that we need. This is based on a few collectives of us just kind of knowledge sharing, but by no means is it complete. We're always looking for advice on what we feel like is the best route to take in order to liberate Palestine as well. Um, yeah. So yeah, this is just a little slide for more resources if you wanted to get involved, but I'm sure Navpreet is going to do a very good job of that at the end.
Thank you so, so much. That was, yeah, what an amazing ability to kind of bring together such like a long history into something so concise with like a clear direction as well for us all to take. So thank you so much. I definitely have some questions that I'll ask at the end as well and want to discuss more because I think you brought up a lot of really, really interesting points, like thinking about Chagos Islands, also thinking about some like bringing in international law to this. So this is really incredible, and I'm just gonna put in the chat um the Instagram for Riso Collective because I also think it's really yeah, you're doing some amazing work for, people in the diaspora and in Cyprus and making these connections and um, mobilizing. Just two quick questions in the chat maybe for you, Jay, is one, if you want to talk about why you crossed out Israel in the slides, and also if you could share the slides.
I
Um,
could definitely share the slides. If anyone wants to just message that Instagram that Navpreet just linked, I can send you the slides for sure. And yeah, I mean, because it kind of kills the collective to say Israel. We don't want to normalize its existence, and it is just a tiny little linguistic thing, but it's also really actually effective in preventing Hasbara bots from flooding your comments from what I've witnessed so far. So it's become a habit.
yeah, no, totally. I think it's good for us all to do as well, thinking about normalizing. Yeah, thank you so much, and we'll yeah, get back into I think some more points on that. So if yeah, other people have questions or thoughts that came from the presentation as well, please keep thinking about them and we can discuss a bit more afterwards. Um, Next from Britain, I'm going to introduce Alfie, who is a writer and organizer with Code Pink Britain. And Alfie's written about the role of like Britain, particularly in facilitating Israel's genocide, and completed some research on this. So yeah, Alfie, go ahead and kind of, I guess, give us some more of the context that Jalan just offered, and yeah, from the British perspective.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll probably go over some of the same points just from more of the British perspective. But that was a super good summary of a lot of the facts that I'm probably going to go over again. But I guess my first point is that in Britain we're sort of trying to emphasize that the role of our government is direct participation in the genocide in Gaza, not just some kind of facilitation, aiding and abetting, but is a direct agent within what's happening. And I think that is like a radicalization of the position that some other NGOs have, or maybe the more mainstream position. So this campaign, UK-US basis off Cyprus, is trying to push that narrative, and as well as trying to influence the state, it's also trying to influence the activist movement and the Palestine movement to sort of take that line as well in Britain. So Britain's particular contribution is through, as we've heard, the RAF bases in Cyprus, which are strategically very close to Palestine, which has been flying surveillance flights over Gaza, transporting weapons and soldiers. Um, and the main part of that is Britain's collection of surveillance over Gaza. So we think that Britain has flown around half all the reconnaissance flights over Gaza, even when you count flights by the US and by Israel itself, which is quite remarkable when you think about it, that Britain is probably flying over Gaza in this kind of specific capacity more than Israel itself is. Um, so in that case, Britain has taken on a specialized intelligence role in the genocide. So since October 2023, we think it's more than 645 flights have flown over Gaza from the bases on Cyprus, which provide real-time intelligence to Israel. So this is an operational contribution. It's not, recording stuff and saving it for later. We think that it is a live intelligence sharing, which makes it, much worse. Basically, it's the most extreme version of this that it could be. So those flights were briefly outsourced to a US company called Sierra Nevada, which is based in Reno. But I think we'll hear about that from a US speaker, so I won't talk about that too much. Yes, as we've heard, the bases are not leased from Cyprus, but a British sovereign territory, similar to other overseas territories, but of course they have their different rules around them that make them different from, say, Gibraltar or Bermuda because they don't have any civilian administration. So this means the accountability for what happens in the spaces is basically nil, and they're governed by a military officer whoever is the commander of British Forces Cyprus, which is just the UK military contingent on the bases, is automatically like the governor, the head of these areas. And he is based sometimes in Cyprus, sometimes in the Ministry of Defense building in London. Um, which is clearly a very colonial relationship. They're not sort of creating other institutions to try and hide this fact. So it's quite an obvious point to be campaigning on in some ways. So the bases in the history have always had an intelligence role within the region. The British decision to retain and legally separate the territory from Cyprus in 1960 was made in part due to their usefulness as a listening post and signals gathering station in West Asia. In 1974, the US prevented a British plan to close the bases due to their significant signals gathering capabilities and agreed to pay an unknown level of base costs in return for their continued operation and increased US access. The government communications headquarters, GCHQ, which is, I guess, like the NSA, would be the UK equivalent of the NSA, leads the intelligence aspect of those bases. And that organization is even more secretive than the military. So there's even less accountability, even less understanding of what they're actually doing. It's all very secret, so it's hard to get information about this. And they operate also separately from the Ministry of Defense. So as Nufri mentioned, Britain and the US created an air bridge made up of bases in Britain, Greece, Cyprus, Italy, and Germany, which has facilitated over 6,000 military flights being flown to Israel, including at least 1,200 that delivered weapons via the air bridge, but it's probably more. That's just the amount that we think could be. And this air bridge has not just facilitated and been a direct part of the genocide in Gaza, but it's also links to genocide in the West Bank, the bombing of Lebanon, Yemen, Qatar, Iran, Tunisia, wherever else Israel is going to bomb next. There's always a role for those bases. So on the 20th of October 2023, the British government sent the British press a D notice, which instructs the press not to report on an issue. In this case, it was the issue of British special forces in Palestine and specifically in Gaza. So that's another element that's hard to get information on. But if they issued a D notice, then it's clearly happening because there would be no reason to issue it if it wasn't happening. So we think that's also part of the role of the bases is the flow of special forces from the UK and the US to participate potentially in the genocide in Gaza. We can kind of summarize the role of the bases into four categories: direct physical intelligence gathering through the spy flight. So where the planes take off from the bases, physically go over Gaza, circle for hours, collecting information, relaying it directly to the Israeli military and come back. Second aspect is the signals intelligence that I talked about. So from those onshore fixed facilities in Cyprus, which gather intelligence not just about Gaza or Palestine, but the whole region and even beyond the region, which have a much greater US role. The third would be the material facilitation of arms delivery, the dual fuel and also dual use parts to Israel. So that's via those physical airstrips. And then the fourth is as a crucial node for UK and US military asset basing, including special forces for transit to Israel, but also for whatever kind of activities they're involved in the Middle East broadly, in support of Israel or in support of this kind of broader imperial agenda in the region. So the British government, in the few times that they have mentioned the surveillance flights, which is very few, report that they are assisting Israel's hostage rescue operations, which I'm not sure anyone really believes. It doesn't even sound like they believe it when they talk about that. But Israel, but even if we do take that excuse, Israel has used the same language to justify its genocide. For example, during one hostage rescue operation in June 2024, they killed at least 300 Palestinians and wounded over 1,000 to rescue 2 or 3 settlers. So even the excuse they're using isn't very effective. And then talk a bit about how the bases have acted as a crucial supply node for weapons and supplies to Israel, and certainly from the US. So there's been international action by workers' movements, progressive governments, and peace movements to block the transfer of weapons to Israel, but the bases on Cyprus undermine that, especially because they're not accountable to any civilian population. They can kind of subvert this progressive movement, and the type of alliances that we try to build can can be quite effectively subverted by the form that these bases take. So that's kind of important to note when we're thinking about activist strategies in the West. So even though the Labour government here in Britain suspended 30 arms licenses to Israel in September 2024, this is only a fraction of the total trade. And crucially, the British government did not suspend licenses for F-35 part exports. So quite a large part of the F-35 is made in Britain. And of course, this is the most powerful fighter jet in the world. It allows Israel to have permanent air superiority in the whole region. Even an act of Congress in the US, it doesn't allow any other government or state in the region to be more powerful than Israel militarily. So clearly, suspending these licenses from the UK was not going to be allowed. So the point being, there are lots of small things that the British government have done to sort of pretend that they're listening to people. But say when you have licenses for F-35 exports still active, that's all quite redundant, really. But I want to emphasize mainly that the bases are one of the main physical nodes of imperialism in the whole region. So when we talk about them, we're talking about their major role in Gaza, but we're also bringing together an analysis or an understanding of imperialism and a setup of regional security framed through imperialism that's crucial for understanding the structural context to the genocide in Gaza and the role of the Zionist project as a whole. And these bases, are a clear example of the neo-colonial reality of all of that. So that's also why it's quite an interesting campaign, an important campaign, because it sort of gets to the crux of that quite well and quite clearly, I think. So in the UK, Code Pink Britain, we started a campaign to close the bases, supported by other groups, much larger groups like Stop the War, and then the group called Peace and Justice Project, and various others. So we held a demonstration outside the Ministry of Defence in March, and we held another one last month. We've lobbied the issue in Parliament. So we've had some MPs from independent alliances, such as Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana, bring up the issue of the bases in Parliament. So we've, sort of worked with these allies to really get this issue on the agenda in Westminster, which has been successful in that regard. We also held a rally outside the offices of Straight Flight Leasing in the City of London, which is a subsidiary of Sierra Nevada, which is the US corporation, weapons company that is leasing its spy planes to the RAF missions over Gaza, which I'm sure we'll hear about from the next speaker as well, because we did this simultaneously with the Coping Group in Reno. And I think Straight Flight Leasing in Sierra Nevada were quite nervous about that action because they're not used to being watched, not used to being held accountable. So yeah, based in the imperial metropole, British movements have a duty to address the bases as colonial issues and must leverage our power to hold the British state to account. So we must oppose the base's involvement in genocide, but also their existence in that broader imperial package of militarism, US vassalage, and occupation. So closing the bases on Cyprus and withdrawing troops is not idealistic, it's quite realistic. Throughout the base's history, post-1960, the independence of Cyprus, Britain has toyed with their closure because they're very expensive, and the British capacity to interfere in West Asia and the Middle East is diminishing as Britain's power generally is diminished. So in 1974, 2004, and 2010, plans were made to either close bases, seize a limited amount of land to Cyprus, or reduce the British troop presence. US interest in keeping the bases open and using them for their own intelligence operations have been a major factor in them staying open. And the renewed sort of bout of militarism and very high military spending under this Labour government makes unlikely that probably we would see a change in the status quo. As Jaylan said, the president that's been set in the Chagos Islands is interesting, so we'd hope to sort of work to use that to inform what activists do here. Yes, as we know, as Nuprit said, the flights have now stopped, the spy flights, in the theoretical ceasefire that's being broken every day by Israel. But the flights are hard to track now. Originally, some flights had their transponders on for the whole journey, so you could see them circling over Gaza, coming back to the bases very clearly. Um, they stopped having those transponders on for the whole time, so you can't see the flights mapped on public flight tracking websites anymore. Sometimes they turn them on for a very short part of the journey, and so you can infer what happened. But basically, it's getting harder to be certain of what's happening. And of course, the base is still there, the planes are still there, so we definitely can't say it's over. If anything, they're just waiting for the possibility of starting again. And obviously, all those other roles that the bases fulfill are still ongoing, being that key part of the air bridge. Yes, either way, campaigning against the bases is of crucial importance. And in the wake of Israel's ever more untenable and unstable international position, I think in the metropole in the US and the UK and the rest of the West, activists need to keep pushing and drawing attention to these bases and their role in genocide in the broader context, regional context. Yeah, that's it.
Right, thank you so much. Yeah, that was a really useful, I think, continuation of what Jaylan began to set out, and the role of Britain, but also the kind of faux kind of lines that the Labour government have tried to push to hide what they've done. Of course, you mentioned the Sierra Nevada Corporation contract, and that came about only after one journalist was brave enough to actually ask a question to the Foreign Secretary, which happened in July. Um, that was like the first question ever asked about the spy flights and if they're being given to Israel. A few days after that, I think they then outsourced this contract to a US company so that it could not be tracked and so that it was now undertaken by this kind of private mercenary group. So you can see how, like feeble and weak this government is, which is on the one hand really irritating because, just if you're taking all this time to pretend you're not doing something, which you are, just don't do it. But on the other hand, it is also useful for us to have such a weak, like this kind of faux liberal government that we can push our campaigns and expose the role that they are playing, even if they hide it. So yeah, again, I have a few more questions on that as well. So yeah, thank you for providing that context. That was a really useful way for us to recognize the colonial role that Britain is playing. I think this very well connects to our final speaker, Brian, who is based in Reno and organizes with Code Pink Reno. Brian's commitment to Palestinian liberation and global decolonial movements also come from reconnecting with his own people's history and culture and as an Indigenous person of the Chamorro diaspora. And he organizes with Code Pink in our work against the military-industrial complex, which is, of course, the crucial and necessary step in order for sovereignty, dignity, and really humanity overall. And yeah, Brian, take it away and bring it back to the belly of the beast itself.
Absolutely. Just a second here. Let me get my screen share set up for you all. All right. Can everybody see that? Okay. Hey, my name's Brian. As mentioned, I'm just a Reno community member and an organizer with Code Pink Reno chapter here in Nevada. I was invited to speak on the US portion of the supply chain and Code Pink Reno's recent actions alongside organizers in the UK and Cyprus, in solidarity with the victims of this ongoing genocide, imperialism, and general warmongering. Just a little bit about Code Pink Reno. We're, of course, a local chapter of the international feminist grassroots organization working for peace and human rights. The Reno chapter, for such a relatively sleepy town, is a very active presence in the community, hosting weekly rallies against our politicians and corporations' complicity in the genocide, tabling basically anywhere they can fit a table, book clubs, screenings, petitions, the list goes on. What drew me personally to organizing with the chapter was seeing how active the group is with local mutual aid and community support. At local initiatives for food security, housing, abolition, education. Code Pink members were out there working on these alternatives to colonialism, criminalization, isolation, and exploitation. I feel privileged to have been involved with the chapter this year and organizing with Code Pink. It fills me with hope, and I would recommend to anyone that you find or you build these types of movements wherever you are. So, talking about, as mentioned, the beast that is US imperialism, military spending, and Sierra Nevada Corporation. So at approaching $1 trillion a year, the US spends more than the next 9 countries combined on its military. It is the single largest category of our discretionary federal spending. And this money is literally unaccountable, as the DoD is the only federal agency that has never passed an audit. So billions and billions and billions of dollars just being sent off somewhere that we don't know. Much of their budget goes to staffing and upkeep of hundreds and hundreds of military installations and bases abroad. Related to today's topic, in the past couple of years, nearly 30 million additional dollars have been spent towards the US installations on RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, which it also uses to transport arms directly to Israel. All of this activity can happen in secret and, as mentioned, without accountability of the Cypriot people, since the base is British sovereign territory. Beyond the upkeep of bases and personnel, another large chunk of the US military budget is in research and development, which is where Sierra Nevada Corporation, or SNC, comes in. As one of the largest military contractors in the world, SNC is awarded billions of US taxpayer dollars each year to develop military equipment for various armed forces branches. And to a growing number of us in the community here, it's appalling how much of our wages go to these arms manufacturers when more and more of our neighbors go hungry, without housing, without healthcare. And through US programs like foreign military sales or direct commercial sales, SNC can also receive the public dollars of peoples all over the world as their governments purchase military equipment and training from SNC. And as I'm about to get into, these dealings are not just innocent business, international business transactions. They're a critical part of what we're calling this supply chain of death. So, knowing all of that, back in August, a number of us were still very surprised when we were notified of the reporting from Palestine Deep Dive and The Times. The articles reported that due to a pilot forgetting to turn off a transponder, they were able to track a US plane directly spying for 3 hours over Gaza. And that plane had taken off from an RAF base in Cyprus. Apparently, the UK had begun to lease spy planes from a US company called Straight Flight, which was a subsidiary of Sierra Nevada Corporation, as we know, one of the largest military contractors in the world. And since the UK was responsible for, as mentioned, a large fraction of the spy flights over Gaza, it really hit us that a local company might have a big role in these flights going forward. Almost definitely this intel was being shared with Israel and used to facilitate the genocide that we had been organizing against. And as mentioned in the slide here, the aircraft intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions, the planes are contractor owned and operated, which means that it is, employees of SNC, not, RAF military personnel who are performing these flights. So that was another sort of just direct connection between this local company and this ongoing genocide. So right away, the planning started. How do we get the word out and mobilize to hold them accountable for this? And then another surprise, but a good one. We were told that organizers in the UK were interested in a joint campaign to address this from multiple angles at once, and instantly we were on board. From that joint planning, we were able to decide on messaging and actions. Right away, we were distributing flyers and talking with the community about SNC's role in spying on Palestinians for Israel's genocide. And then there were the joint rallies. So on August 22nd, we would be protesting at SNC headquarters on the same day as a protest outside their London HQ. And in Reno, our message for that first rally was to the employees of SNC directly, that the world knew that their company was directly complicit in this genocide, to get them thinking more about their role in facilitating these atrocities being committed against the Palestinian people. This multi-billion-dollar military contractor really must have been rattled, since they increased security and they rushed a permit from the city to close down the public street for a block party the day of the rally. Of course, there wasn't any block party that day, but the group was still able to walk out front and let their presence be known. We felt that this action was effective and we wanted to keep the pressure on. So afterwards, we continued our outreach to the community and the joint planning. Then we had the second joint rally in September, this time with organizers in Cyprus, demonstrating alongside Reno and London. This next one was on a weekend, so no one would be at the SNC HQ that day. So instead, we demonstrated a few blocks away outside of a major shopping center in Sparks. We shifted back to the general public as an audience, with our goal just to show as many people as possible how the military contractor just around the corner is complicit with this genocide in Gaza, drawing that line from SNC to the UK to Cyprus to Gaza. We had a much warmer reception at that second rally, lots of honks from cars passing by and shouts of support, which was surprising because Sparks is a bit more of a suburban, more conservative area of town. We were at a big intersection with heavy traffic, so people were able to, read the signs, hear our chants. I think the messaging from the campaign was very effective and concise, and we reached a lot of people in a part of town that we really had never demonstrated in before. Since then, we've continued to push the message, spread the word about SNC and the US's role in Palestine and beyond, to their employees and to our community. And we really appreciate being invited here to share our experience with you all.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Brian. It's amazing to see the photos and to hear your reflection on it. It has been pretty incredible, I think, to connect and I think locate how, this kind of small part of the US. I'm sure like people in the US knew about Reno, but I think a lot of people in London particularly weren't really aware. And obviously there's kind of a lot of history with kind of militarism in Reno. But to be able to make these connections between the literal headquarters of where these flights are being contracted from with the other headquarters of where they're being operated in London. And then, of course, the headquarters of where they're being launched from and based at is quite profound um, to have these connections and be able to organize together and have reflections on how these different institutions and companies are reacting and how they're rattled by us actually knowing where they're based and having community organizers who oppose their existence and can make these direct connections. And I think that's you touched on such an important part of why we have this campaign and why we want to have these kind of conversations and further information about these three places. Of course, there's other links on the supply chain, but these kind of three critical parts. And yeah, it's amazing to do this kind of community work in an area where I assume it's pretty difficult to do as well. So that's pretty amazing. I'm just gonna bring back Alfie and Jalen to um now I guess do what you were mentioning, Brian, these connections that we have, and how we're kind of based in these three places, and have these organizers who are connected. I guess my first question, I think some of you briefly touched on it, but how are people in your local area, in the city, in the country, understanding the role of the base, of the government, of a company in the supply chain of death, in supporting Israel's genocide? Um, Maybe just do it in the order that everyone's spoken. Maybe Jaylan, if you want to talk a bit about, I think maybe yours can be a bit broader, like in Cyprus, in the diaspora, in London, and in general.
Yeah, it's going to be hella broad because there's so many different really complex kind of perspectives on this. Like I would say in general, in the diaspora, specifically the British diaspora, just constantly embarrassed and frustrated because neither state that we kind of assign ourselves with, or, people who have a British passport but are Cypriot by ethnic identity, are just constantly frustrated at the short-sightedness of allowing Israeli investment, which does nothing for everyday Cypriot people, and then being doubly frustrated at the British and Cypriot tag team that is facilitating the island to become another Israeli settlement and at the expense of the region. Um, so that's in the diaspora, because generally, like if you're left wing, it feels a bit more cohesive, I guess. But then when you get onto the ground in Cyprus, it's mental gymnastics all over the place. It's it's insane, very, very complex. I would say, again, from the local perspective, there are so many people doing like endless groundwork. Yes, there are direct action groups in Cyprus. I've just seen that question. Um, so there are groups that are mobilizing to protest not just the bases, but all Zionist influence on the island. And they are scattered around as well. It's most frequently centered in Nicosia, but there are movements in Limassol, which is closest to Akrotiri, and also in Paphos, which is actually an area where Zionist settlers are starting to occupy homes as well. But there are lots of mobilizations. It's just, I think, unfortunately, I feel personally that we're outnumbered by the people who generally observe that Cypriot agency is a myth anyway and don't have much hope left. So even if they do understand the role as beyond the SBAs, and also the Republic of Cyprus is kind of like, well, what can we do about it? Like we have our own occupation to worry about, all the whataboutisms that prevent real action from actually happening, and just kind of giving up at the first hurdle, I guess. And it's also it's a very small island where everyone knows each other. Um, the bases are fortified in a way that if you were to do more direct action, is very risky, especially for Turkish Cypriots who will lose their, who can very easily become stateless citizens. So we really need like people with privilege to help us, basically. Not in a way that we're just like poor people help us, but in a way that's like this is a big issue that needs more power behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in the UK, Britain, yeah, there's different levels to how to what type of people think about what things at what time. I think the broad population, getting them to think about the bases in Cyprus has not been the goals of the campaign, because there's not much awareness of it's like one step at a time, get them to think about Gaza and Palestine, maybe a little bit about UK foreign policy, militarism, especially now as we're going to this militarist turn with Trump's 5% um, NATO military spending thing that the UK has very enthusiastically got behind. So we're cutting a lot of money from welfare and international aid to directly put into the military budget. So that's a very clear thing for people to think about. And I think that's the place to push this issue in terms of whole public kind of raising awareness campaigning. In terms of a slightly more knowledgeable left-wing section of the population, which is quite a big section, especially in London, um, getting people to think about the bases in relation to Gaza has been what we're trying to do. And there was very little awareness of the bases. And if there was awareness, it was only that there was a base there and not the specific ways in which it operated as a colony, and how as a colony it could facilitate the genocide more effectively in a way. So yeah, there's very little awareness about that particular role of Britain. And as I mentioned at the start, I think seeing Britain as a participant in genocide versus facilitating genocide, so just selling weapons versus conducting the spy flights, directly being involved, sending special forces and so on, that was a bridge to cross, and I think something we're still working on. But there probably is increasing awareness of that, especially I think some of the independent MPs in Parliament here have brought it up as well and starting to use that language of Britain being a participant, not just an enabler. So that's something that's probably improving as well.
Yeah, and as far as how do people in our local area, specifically, I'll specifically talk about Reno, Nevada generally, understand their role in our country's role in the supply chain. I think it's a growing awareness. I think a lot of the work of local organizers has been around, you know, it's not just Israel's genocide, right? It's like the U.S. backed, Western backed, imperialist country backed genocide. And letting people know about like just all the material support, military, economic, diplomatic support that the U.S. provides to these atrocities, has been the work of local organizers here. I think after the reporting came out about the spy flights, that's really when we became aware of the issue with Cyprus and these RAF bases and the colonial aspect of it. Yeah, and we've been just pushing that since then. I think a lot of, besides Code Pink Reno, a lot of local groups picked up on this story and were very, very eager to spread that information around about how this local company was involved with the UK and involved with these military bases in Cyprus and involved with the genocide in Gaza. So like I think, like Alfie mentioned, it's a growing awareness, and it's on us to continue facilitating that.
I guess actually just like kind of a follow-up on that as well, Brian. Like how were people previously understanding Sierra Nevada Corporation, SNC, and like are there connections now that people are drawing out between SNC's role in kind of other parts of life in Reno and then the connection very directly to Israel's genocide?
Right. So SNC, it's pretty large presence in our community, especially not just SNC. SNC, not just SNC as a corporation, they have a lobbying arm that is the Sierra Nevada Corporation PAC, Political Action Committee, that they use to lobby politicians on both sides of the aisle here. In addition to their billionaire owners, who are local presence in the community, both of them, Faith and Aaron Osman. Yeah, they have a lot of money to throw around, and they're also a huge presence in recruitment at the university, at career fairs locally. So I think people were aware of SNC. I think they tried to make themselves known as like more of an aerospace, spaceship manufacturer, those kinds of systems. But they do receive billions and billions of dollars for military contracts specifically. So there was kind of that vague awareness. People, there was name recognition, and I don't think people were necessarily as plugged in to the fact that so many of our taxpayer dollars were going towards these military contracts, towards imperialism, right? Versus to the community. And that's really the messaging we're trying to do right now, is that like, hey, this, you can walk down the street and see people suffering, going hungry, going without housing, as I mentioned, without health care. It's getting cold here, the winter's coming. The community is organizing its own overflow shelters for the homeless in the area. The state could be providing a lot of these resources, and instead we're funneling them into these billionaires, into these military contractors. So, yeah.
Yeah, that context is really, really interesting. And I think again, yeah, these are the connections that people are able to make and see that the same forces that oppress them and steal from them and extract from them are also stealing, oppressing, and extracting from people in Palestine and, across the global South. I think also, Alfie, you kind of touched on this briefly about the, the Starmer government, the Labour government, which is in power now, and the push to kind of militarism, following in line with Trump's increasing NATO spending for European countries to 5%, which is kind of part of making Europe fund the proxy war in Ukraine while it can deal with other things. I'm wondering if there's similar connections people are making between kind of the welfare and warfare, and how Jaylon mentioned about the bases in Cyprus cost the British taxpayer a huge amount of money to sustain and operate and facilitate. And the contract that the British government has with S&C is a it's a public contract that taxpayers are paying for. They're paying a military contract in Reno to fly spy flights over Gaza for Israel to kill people and kill Palestinian people in Gaza. So is there a similar connection being made in Britain? And also, Jaylon, you can add on anything else.
Yeah, I think it's probably not in the broad public awareness or consciousness yet, and the debate around welfare spending and linking it to militarism is still probably a relatively niche left position that we should really be pushing more because it's such an obvious thing. And I mean, it's even been said explicitly by ministers who are responsible for various budgets, especially it was most explicit in relation to the international aid budget. There was a direct transfer of a big percentage. It was like around half, maybe I can't remember exactly. The international aid budget was transferred directly to the military budget, and that was said. It wasn't sort of hidden in changes in government spending. It was I think the prime minister or a minister said, we have to be honest about our priorities, what we can afford, blah, blah, blah. So it was very clear. And I think, yeah, there hasn't been enough capitalization on that by the left or by anti-militarist forces here. There's a lot of other stuff going on in British domestic politics, but I think that's a really good point to bring these issues together, austerity, and right-wing social policy here is, very concretely linked with militarism and imperialism and the interests of, say the working class, the proletariat, and the West is linked definitely to the manifestation of imperialism by these countries. So that is something we need to push, but I don't think it's been thought about much. It's not a, something that the government gets asked much, which of course is also an issue with the media. Um, so yeah, that's something we should probably work on, but it's a lot of potential.
I would say people don't ask as well because the British media does such a good job of scapegoating migrants, and so they've already filled that vacuum of where what that answer is. They've already answered it in just a really crappy, inaccurate, false way. I was just saying, I sent a message earlier saying that they're still paying the same amount for fuel because I check the Ministry of Defense spending every time they release a new report. And like when you put it into context, I think it was, yeah, August, just payments to the United States government was 66.5 million. That's just to the United States government. So, I mean, when you put like all of the things that they scapegoat into a direct comparison with the things that are actually the cause of these issues, I'm hoping that would be simple enough to kind of be digestible to the people who are susceptible to misinformation. But British media is just like, it's too powerful. And that's not me to say me giving up, but that's just like, it's why they get to people first. And it's so much harder to debunk than it is to be the baseline of someone's reference, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was actually going to mention the role of the media because I think that has been, and it's like an ongoing issue, is that there's been no reporting on um, obviously the bases in Cyprus, the spy flights, both in the US and Britain, um, as well as like a continued cover up. Of course, we know, and like we know that all mainstream media, obviously in the West, has at best covered up the true crimes of Israel and also like the US and Britain, and of course, actually more accurately, they have been justifying and they play like a very like key role in manufacturing consent for genocide. I think particularly looking at the spy flights, like in kind of all three contexts, like what has the media been doing? Like has there been can we see that there's like some progressive media who's been able to report on it? Obviously, you mentioned kind of Matt Kennard's work, Palestine Deep Dive, which has shown how journalism can actually kind of trigger like movements like this, which really would, we'd only know about because of people's work like that, because of the work of people at Declassified. Of course, we're forever grateful to that one pilot who forgot to turn the transponder off. We wouldn't be here without that pilot. So at least they aren't at least the military remains completely stupid. But I just would be interested in hearing kind of what I don't know what you think the role of the media has been, both mainstream and kind of progressive. Brian, if you want to start, and then other people can jump in.
Right. I guess as far as our context goes, the media landscape in the United States is, I don't think that's unique, that it's just terrible, right? And completely captured by corporations and the elite. So yeah, Jeff Bezos owns, Wall Street Journal, things like that, right? Like, the Fox media landscape as well. But yeah, so on this issue specifically, we've heard basically nothing on the flights. It's all up to these independent journalists, these smaller outlets, right? And I guess in addition to that, it's like hearing from folks on the ground in Palestine, organizers locally. I think fortunately less people are turning to the mainstream media for their news in general, right? So it's a lot of like it has advantages and disadvantages that social media has kind of taken over that role of how people get informed about what's going on both locally and globally. But it's fortunate for us though, because we have a presence on social media platforms that we can just spread that word ourselves. As far as like influence in the local community goes, I think we've entirely relied on just spreading that word ourselves to our neighbors, to our community, at parks, at events, at, wherever, like I said, wherever we can fit a table, Code Pink has a table. So yeah, I guess that's my perspective on that.
Like next. Just reading that message. Yeah, social media is definitely important. And I wanted to give I think because a lot of the people in this call are American, and I want to give some context on media in the UK. So the BBC, being our like quasi-state broadcaster, is going through was in kind of constant scandal. But of course, on the left, we criticize the BBC for being biased to the right and for basically being government media, generally um, supporting sort of state viewpoints, government viewpoints. But on the right, they criticize the BBC for being biased on the left, of being too woke, for being too anti-racist, for being sort of an vaguely inclusive platform, being quite diverse. Um, so it's sort of in constant scandal. And a lot of this happened in the last few years around Gaza when it was trying to make documentaries about Gaza, and one documentary it made had a child narrator who was later found out his father was involved in the civilian administration of Gaza, which was run by Hamas. But not that that should necessarily preclude this child from being part of this documentary, narrating a documentary. It was a very young child. And so they cancelled this documentary. There was a whole scandal, and that just shows the kind of pressure. Even that national broadcaster, that, of course, from our perspective, it's too right wing, but from doing something slightly centrist, just doing a documentary about things that were happening in Gaza, it wasn't a radical documentary. It's just saying the stuff is happening, wasn't calling it genocide, wasn't calling out British role. Even that was too much for that lobby, that right wing lobby here. Um, and now it's being used as evidence that the BBC is biased towards the left, biased against Israel. So that's kind of what the mainstream media is up against. And I guess it just underscores the point that it's important to build alternative media. And obviously, all of the information about the spy flights have come from, or a lot of it's come from Declassified, Matt Card, Dropsite News, and the various independent orgs that do everything through social media, and they're funded by individual donations. So of course that's a really important part of it. And I don't really see an alternative kind of way to build that information space, since what I said about BBC, it's so difficult to do within these institutions.
One question I was actually going to specifically ask about like the media, but also kind of the international angle is when we did the first joint rally in London at the Ministry of Defence and then at RF Akrotiri with groups in Cyprus, that then made like got into some mainstream media in Cyprus. And I think that was a lot of our initial discussions were about, if we can do this work in the Imperial Corps and like show this solidarity in Britain, it can, of course, like advantage and like give hope to people in Cyprus that this is possible, but also give something to the media. And I wonder if like is it kind of a different context there? Like is spy flights more um reported on? Are there more are the bases at all mentioned? And is it easier because you can say it's something happening in Britain? Like is the context a bit different there, do you think?
I think it's already been normalized. So I mean, for everyone outside of the island, the spy flights being documented is something new, whereas for people on the island, we literally see them take off. So like it's not necessarily anything new for people to be mobilized around. It's more actually unpacking why people are still so attached to the British military on the island. And when it comes to that, is when you go into the ethnic divide. And that's actually been, I was going to say that is the main weapon of the media right now, because there's a lot of Zionist propaganda that doesn't just go, it's not just the typical one that we see here about bringing the hostages back or whatever. It's actually Zionists can liberate the North. It's bring Zionists to be the new peacekeepers, to do what the UN fails to do because our divide has been at a stalemate for a good like 70 years at this point. So it's so our media is less about being like anti-British, and everything is centered around how do we just get rid of the Turkish occupation. So anyone that can uh I guess say something that's gonna land in the right place of someone who all they care about is getting rid of the Turkish occupation, that's what they're gonna go with. Doesn't matter whether it's Zionist, doesn't matter whether it's uh a Russian kind of like pro-war perspective, because there's also another community that have brought up a lot of the island. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't think it's not really a moral question. It's more like a very self-serving kind of perspective.
Yeah, of course. That totally makes sense, and it adds another additional, complex layer to things which obviously are deliberately stoked and used as well. And this one kind of more broader question I have is about like obviously we're doing this kind of international solidarity in action, and locally you're also doing a lot of education and outreach. Like, are there a few kind of tactics that have worked, do you think? Are there a few memorable conversations you've had um, that have like moved people to the understanding, better about Palestine, about the bases, about, the need for international solidarity in the face of imperialism? Is there kind of a strategy do you think that's working? Do we need to like rethink what we're doing? Like where do you think we're at in terms of the movement that's like educating and inspiring people? And I don't know if anyone wants to take the question up, but Jalen, was that an unmute?
It was but yeah, if I mean if it wasn't directed at me, maybe someone else could go first. That was the last to talk. Anyone?
I
Um,
can, I can if you like.
yeah, go on, Alfie.
But yeah, it's an interesting question. think like you mentioned before, linking what's happening with welfare cuts is a really good way to that way cut through to people's everyday lives and how their lived experience is linked to the stuff that's happening. But that is only one strategy because the moral question shouldn't only be against war because the money that's you should maybe get in welfare or whatever is being used to kill someone else. So that's wrong anyway. So these are all kind of tactics, strategies, and not all kind of answering like a fundamental moral question of what we're trying to do. Um, and with Cyprus, with the bases, I think it is the idea that we're directly participating, and I think that mobilizes people a lot more than just saying that we're involved or we're kind of vaguely adjacent to something that's happening, or politicians are saying something we don't like. But this is very material. So I think drawing that material link and having such a clear demonstration that this link is real, because people find it hard to believe. People that don't necessarily follow what's happening as closely as we do, or haven't, got to the same point, aren't necessarily on the left or whatever. They find it quite hard to imagine, I think, how involved, in this case, Britain is with genocide, and making that link clear through Cyprus is I think it's a really effective way of doing it because it's so obvious, like I said before, it's not hidden. These are colonies, these are owned bases. There's no democracy. All this stuff is publicly said and asserted. And I mean, Starmer, Prime Minister, visited these bases and said, the work you're doing is very important. We can't tell people what the work is, but it's important. So it's not a secret thing. It's very clear. And of course, there's lots of other ways that Britain is involved in in Palestine. We have bases in Qatar, US soldiers all around the Gulf. But the bases in Cyprus are such a good way in because it is so materially clear and obvious. And yeah, I think in the limited engagement we've had directly with people in this campaign, it has been a really good way of conveying that.
Yeah, I can go next. Just sort of talking about which actions or education that we have been seeing more success in. I would say definitely it helps having support from Code Pink in general of like the Basis Off Cyprus campaign. I think having very clear messaging. I think some of those signs that I showed from our rallies. It allows people to make those connections in their head if the message is just like very short and very clear on what's happening, who's involved, that it's a local actor, that there are international consequences. And yeah, so I think having that messaging, having a rally, knowing what the purpose of the rally is, having a concrete ask. I think that's also, knowing who the audience is, knowing what you're trying to get out of that protest rather than just sort of shouting into the void, right? Has been very helpful for us. And the rallies that we have that prepared beforehand, I think, have been more successful in reaching folks and getting the exact message that we're trying to get out across. I think beyond that, the other thing we found a lot of success in is, as I mentioned, that Code Pink is a very active presence in the community, and not just making it like our own little pet project that we're going to be pushing this campaign. We get as many community groups as we can involved with these actions. We establish relationships, like and as part of the presentation, you'd mentioned that many UK groups have been involved besides Code Pink on the Bases Off Cyprus campaign. I guess the entire Cyprus portion of this, right, is not exactly directly Code Pink related. So yeah, just in your community finding, and it's not like all activist groups, right, that we were involved in. It's mostly just like community support groups, like mutual aid groups, like finding those mutual aid groups, because if you find like the caretakers in your community, they're going to care about these issues, right? So yeah, just being involved as much as you can locally, and knowing everybody, and then when you got something going on, calling upon them.
Kind of similar to that as well, which I can respond to Natasha. So there's There's a few groups. There's to I guess follow on Instagram and kind of keep up with when they're mobilizing because it is quite frequent. We have Genocide Free Cyprus and United for Palestine, Nicosia, Limassol, or Paphos, wherever you're based. But always feel free to shoot me a message and I can help you find other communities that might be closer to you. Unfortunately, like things do get very centered in Nicosia, which really frustrates me to no end. But I mean, um, I can help you find something that's local. And actually, speaking of that, like something that was the first thing that came to mind when I was thinking of a success, which is really, really inadvertently a win for Palestine. So let me cook because this is really inadvertent. But we successfully organized a pan-Cypriot mobilization against the bases. For that one, that was the recent one that happened in Reno, UK, and Cyprus. We had groups from both sides of the divide, which is not often, it's very rare. And in this case, we had people from all sorts of communities. And we had like the two biggest lefty groups in the North attend. And that was such a win because it demonstrates the borderless nature of the struggles and the borderless nature of the solutions to them. So, and in that context, our unification is imperative not just for the displaced who deserve justice, but for the people who in Palestine, in Yemen, in Syria, who are suffering the consequences of us keeping the British colonies on our island. So anything that actually brings Turkish Cypriot and Greek Cypriot, the biggest communities, but that we have lots of ethnic diversity among the island, but anything that keeps them united is a collective resistance to the colonial entity. So it's again, it's very inadvertent. And unfortunately, I do think you kind of have to go through that soul crushing process of explaining why someone's liberation is actually good for you, which I hate doing. But I do think it's an effective strategy, especially for people that have never had a cohesive national identity, for people that are under occupation. It is frustrating, but it is a strategy that I find exactly what Natasha said, that liberation for one is liberation for all. And I believe that completely is how we convince other people.
Yeah, totally. I think that is something that's definitely come out of what you all said, but also like the what's rooted in this campaign is why we want to make these connections and show like what people's liberation is like rooted in. And also not rooted in. You know, we're in these countries and can understand that everything that we have is based on like exploitation and extraction and similar supply chains like the one we're talking about. Like my last question would be kind of on a similar level, but kind of looking to the future. And like, what do you think like people can be doing? What do you think we can be doing in this campaign and also broader in general, like online, on the ground, in these different places, to obviously expose and dismantle this supply chain of death we're talking about, and kind of broader to um, we're in this moment of this supposed ceasefire where the media is less less interested in reporting because they're not like pushed to do so. In the little bit they are when there's, like massacres every single day, which of course there are just on a slower scale. And after this kind of mobilization that has taken place over the past 2 years, and we have these kind of movements that developed and kind of matured. Like what's kind of next for us in this stage to maintain our energy and organizing, um, despite, a pause in the spy flights for now, or maybe similar ways that the British spy flights were outsourced to hide them a bit, and how we see more things like that. How we see this, I think someone else mentioned like these kind of pseudo-liberal governments also trying to hide the realities of what they're doing and making it harder. Obviously, in the US, that's less of the challenge because they will like call what they're doing war. They'll say that we're like not we're preparing for war. This is Department of War. It's much more overt. So it's a kind of different area, which is like how do you then organize in a pretty like crisis situation. So I guess what you all thinking, what are your groups thinking about what's next, what we're doing now, and how we can further the work that we're doing to expose and mobilize people. And maybe if we go in the order backwards again.
Me first? All right. Yeah, what can people be doing to expose and dismantle this process? Yeah, and I guess you mentioned on the ground and online. I just me personally, I would recommend um, less online, more on the ground. Be online to the extent that we can do things like this, where we can practice international solidarity. We can spread, we can get educated. We can learn from each other, share our experiences, and then stop there. If you're able, and if you're able, yeah, and get out there and when you think about what can I do, it should really be what can we do, right? You got to find other people. You can't do this yourself. It's too big of a problem, right? So, and I would focus primarily, what I'm doing is focusing on not exactly directly dismantling these processes, but building the alternatives right where we are. Showing people that there are these alternatives, like I said, to militarism, to this exploitation, to this colonialism. Working with local indigenous groups in your area, land and water protectors. All those things, right? And it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of people. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, there's so many ways to be involved, of course, and I think it's important to think about what your role could be individually and the kind of groups you're involved with, groups that exist in the context that you're in your city or the kind of people you know. It's always, we're trying to answer the question from the start when lots of groups exist, lots of work's happening and happened. Um, and it's important to, yeah, find what groups are active around you, what you're most interested in. Probably something has happened if you just dig a little bit. Sometimes I think yeah, it's not super obvious or easy to find, so you have to have a bit of a look and, like you said, try to connect with people in person in real life if that's possible. That's where those social bonds of activism really happen and where real things can, happen, start from getting to know people. And I would say look at things that have happened that have been successful in mobilizing people around the world. So in relation to the supply chain of death, the dock workers, or at least the movement that has been sparked by dock workers' unions in Greece and in Italy and Spain, mainly, but also in other countries. But I think mainly those, especially in Greece and Italy, very militant unions have been able to build coalition, political coalition, build a national movement around arms shipments to Israel, often via the bases in Cyprus, by the way. And in Italy, there was that, I think it was last month or the month before, there was a nationwide strike around this issue that sort of began with the dock workers and the very militant dock workers unions. So, that's something to learn from. Of course, it's not appropriate in every context, but, how did that come about? How was that successful? Can we build a kind of union power if you're involved in unions? Why are unions in your country not doing that? Like in Britain, that's a big issue. The militancy of unions and the political relationship between unions and Zionism and the arms industry. Um, and certain unions have different positions. So, that's one thing that's very interesting. And how do they mobilize people in civil society? They worked with small and large political parties and social groups to build this coalition. So, they put aside a lot of differences, a lot of political differences, to talk about this one issue, the single issue, day of action, that sort of, got all this energy and focused into one point in one moment in time that was very effective. I think that's a good lesson that you can probably draw from.
Yeah, I really resonate with what you said about staying focused on the goal, which is something that I find extremely frustrating in a lot of movements, which especially in the context of Cyprus, I found that we really need to focus more on conflict resolution because our movements fragment far too easily. And it's just a very obvious example of, we're not being impact focused here, because if we're centering what actually needs to be done, a lot of these conflicts would be irrelevant. And fragmenting is not really good for anyone in that sense. So yeah, in line with that, I really believe that resistance to these systems can be tiny and it can be huge. So even just engaging with someone, like if you're someone that happens to have, like a really good emotional capacity, is really emotionally intelligent, just being there to support a fellow Palestinian or a Sudanese person or a Congolese person, that is a form of resistance and it's using what you're good at to actually help someone. It doesn't have to be this big ordeal or like, breaking down the fence to the bases. It's important. All of these things matter, but it's also not the only way to be an activist. And I think the idea of a perfect activist just puts off and destroys so many movements. Um, and another big part of allowing people to even resist is constructing alternatives and making sure these spaces are safe enough for all kinds of people to attend without shame, without judgment. Um, and on top of that, kind of actually addressing the needs, which is really frustrating again. It's really annoying to give like right-wing people the time of day, but understanding what they're using as an excuse can be helpful because it's actually a way to dismantle their argument and eventually kind of have some kind of common ground, which don't get me wrong, again, it's a soul-crushing activity, but stay focused on the goal. Um, and yeah, and locally, support the work of Genocide Free Cyprus, United for Palestine. We have a global Summit Flotilla team as well, and we always need more people to take on more work, because there's always a lot of work to do, and not everyone has the resources. Um, and yeah, I would also focus on kind of equipping yourselves with talking points to counter disinformation, because it is disgustingly spread like wildfire. Um, and yeah, just trying to not leave a vacuum of blame, like actually have something that people can turn to before asking them to abandon a thought process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. That, like, I think that really rounds it off and how we can use this information and then use this to inform movements, which is the most important thing. Obviously, having the solidarity here is really key and what should inform and push along the work we do. But it is the work that is, of course, most important for us to be doing as well. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining and to our speakers. This has been a really great way to like ground the work we're doing and highlight the need for this international solidarity because we can't sever a supply chain just from one limb. Like we want to destroy all of it together. And the start of that really is educating about what this means. And so I hope we've been able to uncover like very, a tiny part of this massive infrastructure that, of course, the like alliance of imperialist countries have set up. And so our solidarity is like in opposition to that. We can build a network of people and community of people and like the power of people against um, these governments and companies and elite interests that are of course the ones that have the interests of profiting from genocide and settler colonialism, and it's so key for us to have these connections and networks, and we'll be doing a lot more with this campaign with Bases of Cyprus. And for more information on that, I sent a link to go for the website where you can see a list of course, all the organizations that are involved, as well as the joint letter that I mentioned. We also have a petition to the ICC to ask them to get the information that Britain has from the supply flights because they should hand it over if they're not doing anything with it, as well as ways to get involved as well. We want to, of course, push for education, but we also want to push for action. So you can find a lot of information and resources that we have there. And we're always looking for new ideas and ways that we can take action. So if you have been inspired by any of the thoughts that people have had here tonight and have ideas for things we should do, please get in touch and wherever you are based. And yeah, I think it's also just really inspiring and it gives me a lot of hope that we're kind of united in across continents for the same end goal. And I think that is the only thing we need to know is that we will win. And because we have this unity and we have, this determination and we have this understanding of what is ahead of us, but even despite that, we're continuing to organize. And thank you all for your work. It's really, really incredible. And I'm definitely energized to do like more work from this because how can we not when we, yeah, are joined by such amazing people. So thank you all so much, and thank you all for joining. And we'll definitely have more things like this and ways to connect internationally. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for the space. It was beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.